Welcome to Sit Around the Fire, the podcast dedicated to the men and women on the front lines, first responders, military personnel, and their families. I'm your host, Ashley Dillard, a retired firefighter paramedic turned full-time mental health professional. My passion is helping the helpers. Together, we'll explore the challenges, the triumphs, and the real stories behind the uniform. In each episode, we'll talk about mental, physical, and spiritual wellness, along with the unique culture that comes along with serving in a high-stress environment. From building strong relationships to navigating the weight of the job, this is a space where we can be real, share experiences, and support one another. Whether you're on the front lines yourself or you're supporting someone who is, this is a podcast to remind you that you are not alone. So grab a seat, pull up to the fire, and let's get into it. Hey everybody, glad you're listening in today. I am excited and also a little bit nervous about talking about what we're going to talk about today. It is always seems to be like the perfect way the universe works, and then sometimes you have to address and talk about the things that are happening in your life in order to be able to connect and resonate with other people. So I think today is going to be very good for me in a selfish way, but also hopefully you get something out of it as well and realize that we are all human and we all are figuring out what living life is and looks like. And so today I'm going to be speaking to you from a very real place. We are going to be talking about freeze and functional freeze, if you were curious or wondering. And I know we've mentioned it a couple of episodes back that we would be continuing through the 4 F's of the nervous system. So if you haven't had a chance to listen yet to flight or fight, I invite you to go back and check out those episodes so you have kind of a full picture of what we're gleaning into. But today we are going to talk about freeze and functional freeze. So if you remember going back with me when we were talking about watching the Discovery Channel, and we go back to having our gazelle that's hanging out there in the background, eating grass, everything is chill, everything is mellow. The lion, cheetah comes out of the grass. The gazelle recognizes that there's a threat, takes that into consideration. Stress hormones dump into the body. Acute hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. It's that, oh crap, now I need to make a decision type mentality. And here is where we land with freeze. So freeze really is what we consider as an acute trauma response. The unique thing about freeze, whereas when we talked about flight and fight is that we were heavy in the sympathetic nervous system side, freeze is going to be a twist cone of both. So it's going to be both parasympathetic and sympathetic. It can be short in duration, but also chronic in duration if we're looking at functional freeze, which we're going to talk to in just a little bit here. But when a decision is being made about flight, fight, or fawning, which we'll talk about next time, is really when we land in this freeze state. So if we go back to the Discovery Channel in this picture that we have painted, I want you to imagine if you've ever seen one of those videos of those fainting goats where literally the goat will fall over, pretend like it's dead, and maybe its eyes are moving, but the goat itself is not moving. That is what we look like with freeze. Another indication of freeze is when everything really just feels like a lot. So thinking of what's going on within this gazelle's little brain is making a decision feels like a lot. So I'd rather not make a decision and do anything and just kind of feel those really true effects of being overwhelmed or causing that full collapse type mentality. So we're going to talk a lot about some of the things we actually see show up when we go into freeze mode, but I want to highlight and talk first about disassociation, because disassociation is one of these possible outputs to whatever trauma or intense stress, or if we refer back to how full our bucket is, that mentality of what do we have capacity for within our nervous system and within our lives. It is really, really common to see disassociation show up, and it can be something very mild, like an emotional detachment from your surroundings, something to disconnect you from your body and what you are feeling in the moment. And then it can really kind of move down the scale of severity and end up disconnecting us fully from any physical or emotional surrounding that we might be in. So disassociation really does live on a scale depending on where we are with it. And we often see too, overwhelm or shutdown show up in this freeze state because, again, all of these are protective outputs of the nervous system because it's taking in too much, too fast, too soon. So that chronic state of stress or too much stimulus causing that bucket to overflow is really going to be the trigger into when we go into full overwhelm and shutdown, which also leads into burnout usually, which we'll lead into here in a second as well. So freeze, when we look at it, all responses are originally adaptive, meaning that they are a protection method for us essentially, but then also very reflexive. So thinking about the gazelle, if I can be still, if I can pretend like I'm dead, then the cheetah will leave me alone, and that threat or that perceived threat or predator will be mitigated, so that whether the threat is emotional or physical, in that gazelle's mind is, if I'm dead, I'm boring, there's nothing to seek out, and it'll kind of go away. The sympathetic nervous system then becomes activated because in that state, we're still experiencing a high heart rate, tense muscles, our inspiration rate is going to be higher, and we have the parasympathetic side on board because that's what's actually causing that immobilizing effect on the body or feeling very rigid, as well as actually feeling very tired and shut down. So in my own life, in the last several weeks, I went into a very strong freeze / functional freeze state in which everything felt like it was a monumental task. I didn't want to do anything. Reading anything that was kind of meant to be soothing or relaxing, everything felt like it was just a lot to be done. And it's amazing how when we are in these states of freeze, these moments of freeze, is you feel like incredibly exhausted and tired. And that's this dance or the competition between foot on the brake and foot on the gas pedal at the same time. It's really, really exhausting. And what happens a lot is when we're in this state of freeze, it's usually a preemptive into another F or another protective response that we see. It's giving us the chance to decide what we're going to exactly do, how we're going to mitigate the stress or the threat before we do it. However, in the prolonged freeze state, when everything feels so overwhelming, feels like a lot, that's where we get that tonic immobility. So we're not able to actually move into another protective output because, again, we have no capacity within our bucket, but then the system just wants to shut down to stay home and do nothing. Freeze for us can also look like an inability to articulate thoughts. If you've ever found yourself struggling to kind of even put things together or to understand exactly what you're feeling or why, that's usually indicative of a freeze state. Stillness is what the system wants to do, but at the same time, because of that sympathetic state, when that flight side is creeping in, the stillness still doesn't feel very good and it doesn't feel safe. we often find or catch the language of like that I'm stuck or I'm feeling paralyzed. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I don't know why everything feels so overwhelming. I don't know why I feel like I need to shut down. But this is absolutely 100% indicative of this freeze state. When we are also, like we said, in freeze, we have a hard time making decisions. So classic when this shows up, oftentimes when my partner asks me like, what do you want to do for dinner? And literally I could care less about it when I'm in this freeze state is like, I don't know. I don't want to make any decisions. I don't want to make a decision on where we go for dinner. I don't want to do anything because everything feels like a lot. I just don't even want to do it. We can often feel, like we mentioned, stuck, the disassociation part. This is so crucial, you guys, because I encourage you to reflect on and look at if you've ever found yourself doom scrolling is what I call it. So if you're on your phone, kind of scrolling, and then all of a sudden you realize like, oh man, 30 minutes has gone by and I've still been on my phone trying to disconnect from the body or emotionally numb or detach, even getting an altered sense of time. So not really even being, again, aware of how long you're actually on it. And this is where I found myself, full disclosure, is getting lost in a fantasy world. So I got wrapped up in one of the popular book series kind of floating around now, which is full on fantasy type writing, which I do actually enjoy, not always having to read for education or self-improvement or things like that, but just kind of giving myself a break. But what I found myself doing in this state, these few weeks of freeze and functional freeze, is that I was full head over heels into the deep end into this book. And so much so I finished like a 700-page book in literally 3 days. That's all I did was reading. And granted, like, again, I don't think that it's always bad to sometimes give yourself a break and to take a couple days that are just reading. I very much caught myself afterward realizing that my desire or want to be within this book was not for resting or recovering. It was very much to distract myself and to get out of my current conversation or tasks that I was having, or to basically Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to sit down and listen to the podcast. Whether you're actually sitting and watching or you're driving or multitasking, whatever you do, it's super awesome that we can connect with you around the fire. If you want to get further connected into the community that we talk a lot about here, I invite you to check out the link in the show notes below. It'll give you an opportunity to stay connected and at the forefront of all the communication happening. I'm going to send you something special to start working on your nervous system today, so keep an eye on your inbox. And now, back to the show. Not really do anything. Again, going back into that immobility phase of just not really wanting to function. Another big sign of disassociation you can look for in yourself is if you are unable to numb or escape mechanisms like social scrolling, phone games, etc. This is where, again, the disassociation shows up. So pay attention to how much you're on your phone and asking yourself the question of like, why am I actually here? Like, why am I engaging in this behavior? And it's really, really eye-opening when you start taking a tally and you start looking at the accountability side of wondering, why am I actually doing this? And what is the reason behind it? The other one, the common things we see in freeze, isolating, that strong desire to just be on your own, again, because everything feels so overwhelming. There's just that really strong need to numb or detach. And that, like I said, it's done in so many different ways. The other way we can do this too, especially with numbing out, is using substances. So alcohol or pharmaceuticals, marijuana, anything like that can be one of those tools or things that we need to use in order to numb out or detach from the body. And that's why we see so much substance use rampant in our first responder culture, is because, again, we go from these very high states of the sympathetic nervous system in a very sympathetic driven environment, and then it becomes too much at a certain point. So we feel safe to do our disassociating or our checking out when we go home, right? That's when we feel like we can just distract or disconnect or emotionally numb out, whatever it is. Now, the really, really interesting part, and I'm laughing because it's like I'm holding up a mirror to myself as I'm talking about all this, which again, I feel like is really awesome and ironic at the same time. But when we move into functional freeze, that's when we kind of take on the mentality of we only function when we have to. This 100% is a very common practice in the first responder world, is we can be at home in full-blown freeze, disassociating, all those kind of things, isolating, numbing out. But when it comes time for us to go back on shift and back to work, we suddenly snap into this state or this mentality of we got to do what we got to do. We're going to show up, we'll do our job, and then when we drive home and leave, which can often look like not even remembering how we got home, is we go right back into that freeze state. So right back into the disconnecting, the numbing out, all of those things. Only functioning when we have to. And I will tell you that this can become a very strong pattern that's practiced over time. And before you know it, you can be years, decades down the road, and you have found that this has become a very strong practice. We've talked a lot about default mode networks and neurotags that get developed within the system, and this can become a big one. So if we think about this mentality, this pattern that we set up of, okay, we have this method of checking out or compensating protective outputs like we spoke to, it is actually going to take us less energy because that neural pathway has been so reinforced and driven over time that it's easier for us to go into those states of freeze than it is for us to not, because they're so well worn. They take way less energy and way less effort to pick up our phone and to start doom scrolling and any of those behaviors, to dive into alcohol, to dive into marijuana, to grab the pain pills, to be immersed in pornography, gambling, any of those things. It's actually way less energy and effort than it is to choose not to do that, to choose to be present where we are, to be within our bodies, to be emotionally regulated, to work on our nervous system. All of those things takes a lot more effort and energy than it does to follow these old default mode networks. So when we start to, I think there's an interesting nuance to this as a first responder, because we can get kind of an idea of when we start to see this build up and perpetuate over time, and we catch ourselves kind of using a framework, a catchphrase, or a mentality of that I used to mentality, that I used to enjoy being a mountain climber. I used to enjoy hanging out with friends. I used to enjoy going to the gym. I used to enjoy whatever it is, fill in the blank. Whatever that activity or identity was, that becomes a used to. And that's a cue, a sign of like, okay, I might be in a freeze state or in a functional freeze state when that phrase shows up. We talked about a little bit that idea of like feeling like blah, but really having that strong lack of motivation that comes along with the chronic fatigue, like we mentioned. I saw this 100% show up for myself, and speaking to the realness of it is on my sleep tracker. I was sleeping about 9 to 9.5 hours a night, and I would wake up still feeling exhausted. There was no other impactful changes of anything happening. My schedule was still kind of pretty much the same, but I was full blown like sleeping a lot and still waking up in that chronic fatigue type state. So never really feeling rested ever. And again, workouts, fitness feels really cumbersome. The soreness takes much longer to go away as well too, like we've talked about in past episodes, how that's a reflection of the state of your nervous system and stress hormones and everything like that. But really paying attention to when we're in freeze and functional freeze and we see that state of chronic fatigue show up, we really need to pay attention to that, and we really need to get curious about why it's happening. This is often where some of the burnout symptoms come into play, because this pattern only lasts for so long. And before you know it, you start getting to the burnout level, which we have all either been there or worked with people who are in this burnout category, where we kind of joke about them being old salty dogs or cranky anytime the tones go off and you have to run a call. But these are the folks that, or those of us who experience it, who really just don't even like running the calls anymore or doing the work anymore. So it's that whole state of what we used to start with in terms of being really excited, having like a good sense of mission, why we're doing the job, into now this whole exhausted, the physical symptoms showing up, avoiding calls or activities. So when you have somebody who used to, again, using the language, used to like, being on the nozzle in a fire or being the first one into a call, now they're suddenly kind of hanging out towards the back, or they're not as engaged in training as they used to be, or not as willing to participate in activities or be a part of things, maybe hanging out in their room a little bit more often, or not checking in as much, but really kind of just checking out is where we start to see that more things move down the scale in a much more of a critical capacity than where they were. Now, when we talk about freeze and functional freeze, is like this isn't an end-all be-all. There very much is a response to this, and that is, it does have to be a commitment to doing the work first, to be aware of what's happening and trying to understand the best of our capacity as to why, but then really choosing to do the work around it, which means you're going to have to be responsible for your own nervous system. You're going to have to constantly, you can't just commit to doing the work on your nervous system when everything is in really pleasant states and everything feels good, and or when things feel really terrible and bad, when you're using them in rescue case scenarios. You're going to have to commit to working on your nervous system all of the time. And I call it being a master of your nervous system, because you're really the one that calls the shots here. Nervous system work, including neuro drills, tactical breathing or breathing drills, meditation, things like that are all going to be part of these things that are going to work towards that. But the other really big thing that I think sometimes we miss or we don't often think about is literally getting outside. Being outside, getting sunshine, taking a walk, but being out in nature, especially if you can do something where you're barefoot and actually in the earth, grounding yourself, is huge. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down soon. But being outside, getting your vitamin D, being in the sunshine, doing something outside, it is amazing, you guys, to see what big of an impact that is. And think about our jobs, right? Like whether we are sitting in a car for 12 hours for our shift, especially if you're a shift worker and you work swings or overnight. Like, it's dark outside, you're trapped in your car, you're not moving around. And or if you're working 48s, 24s, whatever at a station, is like you go do your thing, you come back and you sit down or you lay down. Like, everything, you don't spend a lot of time outside. And even more so if you have a desk job, 9 to 5, right? Now you're really inside a lot. So if you're working in admin or one of those kind of folks, it's so important for us to connect with nature and to be outside. So even a little bit of that every day will make such a huge difference in the way that you're feeling. This is what the sun feels like on my skin. This is what it feels like to be walking outside. All of those things are going to bring you back into your body and out of those disassociated states that are pulling you to disconnect from your body or to numb out. Being outside, one of the top 3 ways you can make a big change in your system. The other thing that is really important when we get into these states of freeze and functional freeze is connecting with other people. These really, truly quality, intentional, genuine connection with other people is what's going to help keep us grounded back to the space where we are. Leading back into my story over the past few weeks, I can tell you that it took strategic people checking in with me and letting them know, for one, that they're here for me if I needed anything, but making genuine connection and conversation about, what do you need from me right now? How can I show up for you? Intentionally helping and supporting me in ways that were super impactful for me, that help get me out of this state of feeling like I'm just completely immobile and overwhelmed. It is very much underrated how important these genuine connections really are. So I encourage you to take an inventory, to look at, who are these people in my life that I know I can go to and say, like, hey, I'm not doing good. Like, today is not a good day. This week is not a good day. And allow yourself to feel safe enough to be vulnerable and opening up that dialogue and that conversation, because I guarantee you that there's going to be a time when the scenario or the story is going to be flip-flopped and you're going to be put in a position where you can then show up for them in the way that they show up for you. It's the coolest dynamic of what relationship and community is meant to be, right? Is showing up for one another when it is really hard for us to show up for ourselves. So maintaining those genuine connections, really being okay with tapping in, even if it's ugly crying, nobody cares, it's all right, like, you're allowed to do that. But those 3 things, between doing your nervous system work, being outside, and having genuine intentional connections, those are the 3 big antidotes when it comes to finding myself in a state of freeze and functional freeze. Now, we have one more F to make it through here, and that's going to be the fawn response, which we're going to talk about next episode. And fawning is one of my favorite things to talk about. It is so fascinating and impactful for people when they can learn about this state of fawn. So I invite you to join me back next time. But thanks for tapping in and listening, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sit Around the Fire. We're excited to keep the conversation and connection going. I invite you to check out our website, link in the description below. Also, don't wait to get signed up for the upcoming workshop, Strengthening Bonds, working on efficient communication between first responders and their partners. You can sign up for this via the website or the link in the description in the notes. We look forward to sitting around the fire again with you very soon.